Welcome to the family!
Hi guys, Yam again, and today I'm going to cover information to help you work on the Disabilities Awareness Merit Badge. This video is designed to educate Scouts on disabilities and to help them complete requirements 1A and B, 3C and D, 5C, and 7. Requirements 2, 4, and 6 are things Scouts will have to do locally and on a personal level. Not everything in this video will be in the order of the requirements, so pay close attention and keep notes. So then, what is a disability? Well, a disability is a physical or mental condition that causes an individual to be limited in their movement, activities, senses, or ability to communicate. Let's talk about two really good terms for disabilities awareness: neurotypical and neurodiverse. A neurotypical person is someone whose brain functions like the majority of other people in the world. A neurodiverse person is someone whose brain works differently than the average Joe's, and that may mean that they need special help, accommodations, or even just a little bit more understanding. Oftentimes, a neurodiverse person will have what's called an invisible disability, which means they have a disability that you can't see or tell that they have just by looking at them. But just because you can't see a person's issues doesn't mean they aren't there. So anytime you hear someone say something like, "That kid is just a brat," or "their parents should spank them so they behave," the people saying those things may be unintentionally discriminating against someone with an invisible disability. It's really important to understand that someone who has a disability doesn't owe you an explanation. It's very rare that someone who has an invisible disability advertises it with a sign or a shirt that they're wearing, and even if that person has different needs, they're still allowed to exist in society without having to tell you their medical background. And for a lot of people, it can be a very touchy thing to talk about, so a good rule of thumb is to be as kind and respectful to everyone that you can, because you just don't know what a person is dealing with. Many people who have a disability also need help with accessibility. Accessibility is when a product or an environment is designed with a certain disability in mind. For example, a lot of cities have crossing lights for pedestrians that make noises or play a song when it's safe to walk across the street. That helps people who are blind or otherwise visually impaired better navigate the city with less risk involved to them. Because just imagine needing to cross a really busy street, but you can't open your eyes to see the light when it says walk. And that would mean that you would lose the independence and freedom to walk around by yourself, because you could very realistically get hit by a car. Depending on the situation, accessibility might be something that a person does on their own behalf. Like someone at great risk of falling might buy a soft sink for their own personal bathroom to reduce their chances of injury. Or accessibility can be required by the United States government through the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. As an example, if someone who can't hear needs to go to court, the court would be required to provide that person with an interpreter who knows sign language, so that way the hearing impaired individual could effectively communicate with the judge and vice versa. People who have disabilities may also need accommodations and adaptations to work or live more comfortably. Accommodations are things done at a job or in public spaces to make it possible for people with disabilities to have equal access. Some examples of accommodations are having lowered sidewalks so a person with a wheelchair could safely get across the street. Including Braille on signs so that visually impaired individuals can navigate the world around them is another example. Handicap parking is also an accommodation to give special vehicles more room in a parking lot, as well as offer a shorter traveling distance to the building's entrance. Adaptations are usually tools that help an individual with disabilities perform routine tasks without help. Adaptations can be adaptive equipment and can include a wheelchair, a hearing aid, a phone with large buttons, doorbells that light up, alarm clocks that vibrate, or even something as simple as a cane. The advancement of cell phones is another form of adaptation that has greatly helped the hearing impaired community communicate through video calls, texts, and email. Before that, people with hearing impairments had to use caption phones, which are these huge devices that make transcripts of the conversation, or they would have to use a video relay service where the interpreter would translate the phone conversation back and forth. And of course, while talking about accessibility, accommodations, and adaptations, it's a great time to bring up service animals. Service animals are animals that provide assistance to a person with a disability. Many service animals have a specific function. For instance, a guide dog will act like the eyes of a visually impaired person to keep them mobile and safer. Similarly, people who are prone to seizures may have a special dog that is trained to detect and respond to seizures, and that can help save their owner's life. While dogs are the most common service animal, cats, miniature horses, pot-bellied pigs, some types of monkeys, and many other unexpected animals can all become certified service animals too. And even though service animals are trained to meet a specific need of a person with a disability, there are also therapy animals and emotional support animals. A therapy animal is usually a dog, but again, it could be anything, and they're animals who have been trained to sort of work in the public to bring up the joy and the happiness of those around them. I know, if you're like me, you're thinking, what animal is not already bringing joy to everyone around them? But usually a therapy dog is taken into a larger group of people to interact with a lot of different individuals, so they might go to a hospital or a nursing home or a school, and just depending on the animal, it may be there to lift everybody's spirits, or it might have another specific function like being a reading dog. Where I live, every so often they have a therapy reading dog come in and sit down, and kids who struggle reading can sit there and practice reading out loud to the dog. And for some kids, it really reduces the stress that they feel while they're reading, and it really helps them improve their skills. And I've volunteered with people before who bring in their dog and they bring candy to people in a nursing home, and it really just brightens their day a little bit because they don't always get a visitor, and now here's this cute little dog just cuddling up and licking them. It's so sweet, and it can make people so happy. Now, emotional support animals are kind of similar, except they usually just work with one person. So instead of the dog working with everybody in the hospital and having to be super friendly, an emotional support dog is one that you would own, you would take care of it all the time, and it might help someone cope with anxiety or depression or a number of other things. Now let's touch on etiquette. You should always do your best to be sensitive to someone with a disability. If you can't see their disability or you can't tell what impairment they have, please do not guess at it. Even if you mean well, it will come off as very rude and offensive to a lot of people. Another good tip is using person-first language, except in the case of autism, but I'll cover that in a few minutes. Person-first language is when you recognize the human being before their disability. So you would say a person with a wheelchair and not a wheelchair person. Or you would say, there's a man with a disability sitting next to me, instead of, there's a disabled person sitting next to me. And it's not just about the tone of your voice. It's about prioritizing the human before their impairments. A lot of etiquette around disabilities involve being thoughtful and polite with your language. It's always best to never make assumptions about why a person looks or acts a certain way. You can try to ask questions if you're genuinely curious, but remember to be respectful if that person does not want to talk to you. Many people who have disabilities have experienced traumas or met a lot of unkind people in their lifetime, so their situation may be very difficult for them to talk about. Plus, don't forget, their information is private and they don't have to share it with anybody. Another form of etiquette would be giving someone who has special equipment extra space. So if you're in a crowded space and you see somebody with a wheelchair or a walker struggling to get through, you can do your best to step aside and give them enough room so that they can get by comfortably and not have to worry about running over people's toes. Now, I want to go more in depth on visible disabilities, which again, are disabilities that you see when you look at a person. For the sake of this video, I'm going to say visible disabilities a lot to make it easier to understand for any younger viewers out there, but in regular day-to-day life, most people would just refer to these as disabilities. Visible disabilities come from a wide array of issues and may come from a disease like cancer, aging, such as an older person losing mobility and maybe needing a cane, a medical emergency like a stroke, an accident like a car wreck, or it could be something a person was born with like cerebral palsy. Visible disabilities would include people with wheelchairs, canes, walkers, people who use oxygen tanks, or people who are different physically, such as someone who lost a leg, someone who can't straighten their arm, or someone who experiences uncontrollable shaking in parts of their body. Okay, there are so many visible disabilities out there that I could go on for hours, but I want to switch over to invisible disabilities because they can be so much harder to notice and understand. Again, an invisible disability is when you can't see someone's handicap. Oftentimes, someone who has an invisible disability can seem completely average when you talk to them, but their brain works differently in some way or another. Some examples are coordination disorder, which is when a person struggles with their motor skills or putting their motor skills to work. So someone with coordination disorder might try very hard to write, but they'll never have legible handwriting. Or they might try to get a dance routine down, but it just doesn't click for them on how to keep up. Dyslexia is when a person has trouble with words. Like most disabilities, it can be very different for each person. I have dyslexia and I cannot easily read books. Usually my biggest issue is that my brain will take a word from one line and insert it into the line I'm reading. So I get to the end of the sentence and I'm like, that didn't make any sense. It also makes reading very straining for me because I have to put so much mental energy into keeping the words in order, but I usually don't have a problem reading comic books where the sentences are shorter and there's a lot of imagery to break up the text. Other people who have dyslexia might have all the letters switch around, they might write backwards, or they might not be able to read or write at all. Mental health can also be an invisible disability with issues like anxiety, depression, PTSD, and so many others. The last invisible disability I want to cover is autism, and I'm going to spend a lot of time here because there are a lot of misconceptions out there about autism, but the information I'm about to give you is straight from Autistic Voices and parents of autistic children. Autism is classified as a disability, but that doesn't mean it's disabling for everyone who has autism. Autism is actually a very common diagnosis, and in the United States, 1 in 54 people have autism. So chances are, even if you don't realize it, you probably already know several autistic people. Now, the media has a stereotype that they like to use for autistic individuals, but autism is not one size fits all. It's actually on a very broad spectrum. I love this infographic set. I think it explains it perfectly, so I'm going to go over this. When a lot of people hear autism spectrum disorder, they think that the spectrum looks like this, where a person is either more autistic or less autistic. But that's not even remotely true. A spectrum looks something more like this rainbow wheel. So instead of a straight line that's more autistic or less autistic, there's a lot of categories that can have ranges in each one. The examples used here, and again there are a lot more issues that could be added to this, are fixation, noise sensitivity, social difficulty, anxiety, abnormal posture, poor eye contact, tics and fidgeting, aggression, and depression. And the artist who made these infographics gave an example of what her spectrum versus her brother's spectrum would look like. And as you can see, they're very different and they're both all over the place, even though they both have autism. So the spectrum doesn't look like this. It's really more like this, where all the different factors come together to make up how a person is. So, because the spectrum is so diverse, it's also frowned upon to label autistic individuals as high-functioning or low-functioning, because, like everyone else, they're going to be good at some things and not too great at other things. So the idea of high-functioning or low-functioning is just way too simplified to work. And really, if you label somebody as low-functioning, it's like you're saying they can't do anything for themselves. And if you call them high-functioning, you may think it's a compliment, but what you're really telling that person is that you don't think they have any issues that they need help with. And that can become a big problem if somebody needs accessibility accommodations or adaptations. Also, even though every person with autism is different, autism is often a social disability because autistic individuals often communicate or experience the world differently than their peers. And you might notice that I keep saying autistic person instead of person with autism. That's because many people in the autistic community do not prefer person-first language. Autism isn't like a wheelchair or a disease. You don't catch autism, you can't get rid of it, and it's not a piece of equipment that you can just go replace. It's just the way your brain is wired from birth. So autism is often considered to be part of who the autistic individual is. Think about it like this. A man born in France isn't called a person with French, is he? No, he's a French person. And it's the same idea with autism. This also applies to several other disabilities, like you wouldn't say person with blind. But if you're ever in doubt, you can always ask that individual and say whatever they prefer. And a big myth about autistic people, especially autistic kids, is that they're unfriendly or they prefer to be alone. It can be very difficult for a lot of autistic individuals to initiate contact because their mind is wired to communicate differently. So they can be very blunt, direct, and literal when speaking with somebody, which can make people feel very put off. But most autistic individuals really do like interacting with others and making friends. This is especially true if you have the same interests because it can make for some great conversation. Okay, let's switch gears to talking about more broader ideas like playing sports with a disability. You've probably all heard about the Special Olympics or Paralympics where only individuals with disabilities can participate. But there are also other opportunities for people with disabilities to be athletic. Depending on the disability, many individuals can still join the same sports leagues that any other kids join. There are also special leagues like wheelchair basketball, which is exactly what it sounds like. And that gives opportunities to different groups of people with disabilities to participate. Of course, there is a downside in that if you live in a small town, you're probably not going to find enough support to create a sports team or league based around one specific disability. And now that we've talked about disabilities, let me cover advocacy. Advocacy is a very broad term, and it can mean anything from collecting signatures for a petition to the government, spreading awareness for a cause you care about, or volunteering with an organization to help a cause you care about. You can even be a self-advocate where you stand up for something that you personally need or that you are personally affected by. Sometimes the need will be met just by requesting it, and sometimes, unfortunately, there can be budget or social issues that force you to really fight for the help you need. For Requirement 5C, I've already covered a few myths and misconceptions about people with disabilities, but here are some more to ensure you have enough to complete the requirement. So here are some common false ideas. All people in wheelchairs can't walk. Actually, a lot of people who use wheelchairs are only using them temporarily or only in locations where their mobility could pose a problem. So they might not need a wheelchair to get around their house, but they need it to get around the store. If you have a physical disability, you're mentally disabled too. Not true at all. A lot of individuals may be physically impaired but have an average mind. Stephen Hawking, for example, had extremely limited movement, but he had one of the most brilliant minds in the world. People with disabilities don't have feelings, and they don't understand if you make fun of them. So false. Everyone has feelings, even if they don't know how to express them clearly. And oftentimes, a person with a disability is aware that you're making fun of them. They just don't always understand why. If someone doesn't speak, they are mentally disabled. Again, that's not true either. Some people struggle greatly with communication, even though they might be very smart. Not everyone is able to express themselves verbally or on paper, but that doesn't mean that their mind isn't working. People with a hearing aid can't speak. This varies a lot by person. Most people who have hearing aids are able to speak, but it may take some effort on your part to get used to their voice and speech patterns. American Girl recently put out a really neat doll named Joss, and she was born deaf in one ear and wears a hearing aid in the other ear. So even though she only has about 25% of her hearing overall, she's still able to communicate like everybody else. And that character was also a surfer and a cheerleader, so her disability didn't stop her from doing anything that she wanted to do. If someone can't see, they have excellent hearing. Okay, anybody who's watched Daredevil, I forgive you if you're confused, but people who cannot see usually do train themselves to pay close attention to sounds that other people tune out. That doesn't mean their sense of hearing is different or heightened. It's just been refined to help the visually impaired person better navigate the world around them. People with dyslexia can't read. It is different for each person, but many dyslexics are able to read, write, and do math in some form or another. They may be able to cope and do it all on their own, or they may need help. Again, almost no disability is going to be one size fits all. People with disabilities can't get married or have kids. No way! It's another issue that's very different for every person, but the vast majority of people with disabilities still date, and many of them get married and have children. People with disabilities only want to be friends with other people who have disabilities. Nope! Everyone likes having friends, and if we're only limiting ourselves to people who are just like us, we'd all be alone. It would be too difficult for me to have a friend with a disability or to invite them to my party. Don't let a disability block you from the person on the inside. Many people who have disabilities are self-sufficient, and if they are not, chances are extremely low that they would expect you to handle their care as a friend. Many parents are even afraid to handle a child with disabilities at a birthday party, but a simple conversation between the parents will usually reveal that the disability isn't as bad as the party thrower would imagine, or some kind of caregiver would attend the party too, so that the child with disabilities can participate without putting, a bunch of stress and burden and unpreparedness on the parent throwing the party. Even when you can't tell by their reactions, rejection and being excluded is very painful for kids with disabilities. If I don't get along with someone who has a disability, I'm a bad person. Wrong? I strongly encourage you all to be open to finding friends everywhere, and definitely don't be the kind of person who invites the whole class except the one kid with crutches. But sometimes personalities genuinely clash, or you just don't have any of the same interests. It's okay to not get along with someone who has a disability as long as their disability isn't the reason you don't like them. Now, on the job front, some ideas for career paths where you can work with individuals who have disabilities would be a special education teacher, an SSA, a physical therapist, a speech-language pathologist, or a behavioral specialist. Any of these jobs would require a 4-year degree, so a bachelor's degree. Depending on your local and state requirements, you may also have to get a master's degree or special certifications. You guys are welcome to do any research that you want to, but I happen to know someone who's an SSA, a Service and Support Administrator, so I'm going to turn this video over to her for a minute to let her tell you herself what her job is and what she had to do to get there.
Hi, my name is Danielle, and I am an SSA or Service and Support Administrator. I work with individuals with developmental disabilities, and another title for my position is a case manager or caseworker. SSAs may also be referred to as SSCs or Service and Support Coordinators. Each individual county board can come up with their own title for the position. But generally an SSA is the standard title throughout the state of Ohio, which is where I currently work and live. Even though our job is considered by some to be in a social work related field, not all SSAs are social workers. You are only considered to be a social worker if you have a degree in social work and have passed the licensure to be a licensed practical social worker or a licensed clinical social worker. So there are some SSAs that are licensed social workers, but being a licensed social worker is not required to be an SSA. SSAs are employed by local county boards to help coordinate services for individuals with developmental disabilities. Here in Ohio, there are 88 different counties, and each of them have their own local county board and hire their own SSAs to provide those services for their individuals. The state of Ohio's education requirements to be an SSA is only an associate's degree and preferred some experience working with individuals with developmental disabilities. However, most county boards independently require that people applying for the position of an SSA have a bachelor's degree. One example that I can give is that the county in which I work, our local county board requires a bachelor's degree and a preferred experience with developmental disabilities before being employed as an SSA, whereas a neighboring county to me only adheres to the state requirement and only requires an associate's degree to be an SSA in that county. Some of the job duties of an SSA or case manager can vary widely depending upon the type of caseload that they work with. Each county handles assigning caseloads in a different way. Most counties will typically separate the caseloads based upon certain patterns, such as age or situational demographics, to create specialized caseloads for the SSA, such as having a children's caseload, maybe children served between the ages of 3 and 6, or a transition caseload, which is typically when you start looking at high school to graduation. So around the ages of 14 to adulthood would be what we consider a transition caseload. Or some people have caseloads entirely of adults. Or myself, I have a caseload in which I serve individuals that are completely reside in residential facilities. Some of the job duties of an SSA include locating providers to provide services for their individuals, authorizing those services by completing an annual service plan and updating it as needed and as situations change. These updates are called addendums and are done as changes occur. Another part of completing these service plans is monitoring the services, and usually what that looks like is written into the annual service plan, such as how often the SSA will visit, where they will visit, and how often they will check in with the individual, the family, or the provider to see how things are going. Another part of our job, and it's the part that I think frustrates a lot of our SSAs, but is very important, is completing service-related documentation, or what we call case notes. This is a record of how we spend our time monitoring services. This is usually billed to the Ohio Department of Medicaid. That is how the local county board pays for our position, is the billable, what we call TCM, or targeted case management hours, that we bill. And we have to basically detail what we did, why we did it, and why, and for the individual that we did it for, with exact times and dates. Occasionally, an SSA will be enlisted to provide what we call direct care to our individuals. These are usually in emergency situations, as this is not a billable service for case managers, and so most county boards ask case managers or SSAs to limit the amount of time they spend completing direct care. Direct care examples could be taking an individual to the doctor when they don't have a provider to do so and they need a ride, or they need somebody to help relay important health information that they're not able to do for themselves. Helping someone if they had a provider who suddenly quit and they now need assistance getting to the grocery store. There could be a situation where, an SSA might go and pick up that individual and take them to the grocery store so that they can get their groceries. These types of errands can be done on behalf of the individual or with the individual. And like I said, typically this is supposed to comprise less than 10% of our entire time serving as a case manager, because we're supposed to be helping to find providers that can provide these services for our individuals, and then we do the monitoring of that service. So I hope that you have learned something from this video about what it takes to be an SSA, or a Service and Support Administrator, and what the job sort of entails. I think it's very important work working with individuals with developmental disabilities and being an advocate for their for the individuals and for their families to be informed and know their rights and know and be given the best possible information to make the best possible decisions for themselves or for their loved one with developmental disabilities.
Thank you so much, Danny. And I believe that should be everything you guys need to complete the majority of the requirements for disabilities awareness. What I would love to have all of you leave here knowing is that people with disabilities are not lesser beings. They're just different. And people who have disabilities want to make friends like any other kid out there. Individuals with disabilities are part of our community, and we should do our best to embrace them for their differences, not shun them because they're unique. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching and good luck to you on your scouting journey.